That's my
Yeah, began,
grandfather.
You ready?
Yep.
Hit us.
Now, there's lots of stories about Robber's Roost, and I don't know the true stories. There's some that I don't think are true, but they're all stories and they're all good, and that's one thing about history is it's fun to be able to tell them. First time I came out to Robber's Roost is when I was 12 years old, which is just exactly 70 years ago that I was right here in this same spot. Except we didn't come up on four-wheelers. We were camped over at Swayze Springs, the upper trough, and we hiked all the way over here. Every little hill, it's just over the next ridge, just over the next ridge. There were a lot of next ridges.
Shanna
But-
tried that, didn't you?
I did try that with you.
But there was a group of robbers that was out here. In fact, I asked Sherm Tolbert, I said, was there more than one? He said, no. Well, I found since then, there's a guy named Ben Tasker that was out here. Ben Tasker is the most noted outlaw in the state of Utah. I've been trying to do a little research, but it's kind of sketchy. I'll tell you one story that might have been debunked on him. Nothing to do with this. That he was so mean that he got upset with one of his workers and had him dig his grave, stood in the grave, shot him with his shot the guy with his own revolver, and then built a fire over and burned it. And I was told that somebody recovered that revolver and still has it up in Ogden. But then I've heard that's just a big story, so I don't know. But I do know that Ben Tasker was out in this area for about a year, somewhere in this area. He had nothing to do with the story I'm going to tell you. But the robbers, why did they start robbing? Easy going, right? I'll tell you their names right now. One was named Ornis Nay. By the way, some of the old timers called this Nay's Hideout out here instead of the Robber's Roost. There's one named Frank, Holly, and he was 32, Nay was 28. There was a guy named Francis, and he was 40. And then there was a kid named Erastus Anderson, and he was 19. And there was a kid named Earl Ray, or Sylvester Earl, and he was also 19 years old. There was another one we'll talk about in a little while. It was named John Bentley. Now, some of those people have been involved in some robberies. Like, how many knows where the Kelton stage ran? Probably none of you. Have you ever heard of Park Valley, Utah? Up by Snowville? And you've heard of Oakley, Idaho? Well, the stage ran between those two. And that stage was robbed once going one way. When it came back the next day or two, they robbed the same stage. Ralph Crafts told me that this group of robbers also went up into Idaho and even to Yellowstone, because back in those days, that's where the rich people had the money, and they were hit a few times. May not have been the whole group that was out here. One of them had an alias name of Jack Todd. It was implemented in the robbery down at Silver Reef in Utah, plus a few others. It's been documented. But here's my story, kind of. I think those guys were sitting around and like, remember the first train that was robbed in Nevada? It was in 1870. And it was they robbed the train between Verda and Reno. You probably don't know where Verda is, but it's about 15 miles or so west of Reno. And they stopped the train there, tell you quickly, I can tell a little bit more, but and robbed that train. You got $41,000. Now today that would be equivalent to about $1 million or close to it. And can you imagine the eyes flashing? But this was earlier, but I think that fed in the story. And so I think they thought, well, we can pull a heist. We're getting pretty good on doing some of these things. So they decided that they was going to pull a heist of a railroad. Now, the railroad that they were talking about was a place called Montello, Nevada, which is 58 miles by road from Wendover. That's where the train track was. And so with that in mind, they pulled a job at John Devine's store out in Ivapaw, which was called Deep Creek at that time. And they got quite a lot of winter wear and guns and a bunch of other stuff. Now, if you're going to pull a heist, and the heist was pulled on the 22nd of January in 1883. And the travel, if you went by the way the crow flies, from right here, you're roughly almost 140 miles. Well, they didn't go by the way the crow flies. And so if you take some trails that you maybe think they went, they probably went anywhere from 160 to 180 miles, maybe even further to get there. So they had to prepare for that robbery. Now, how many of you know where Willow Springs is?
Depends on which one.
Willow Springs, Callio,
Okay,
out where the big tree is.
okay.
What's their names? I'm broke. Anyway, that feeds into it. These guys went out there and bought 3 tons of oats. And they were kind of noted. The local people knew that there were some out here, and they thought that they were horsemen, and so they were actually taking care of a few horses for some people. But they went out there and got 3 tons of oats and brought them in the wagon. Apparently, they laid them out along the trail, along with other things. We found out that they had killed a half a beef as part of the stash. And when it's below 20 to 30 degrees, you didn't have to worry about refrigeration, so they had these little weigh stations. How long would it take you to ride a horse in the winter in the snow, 20 or 30 degrees a day? Jim, you're an old horse man. What would you guess they would go?
I think you could do 20 a day easy.
20?
And maybe up to 30 or 40, depending on the day.
Well, yeah, but that's, that's what I thought too, probably 20 miles.
I've rode 35 to 50 for a week.
And that's
it
a
can
long
be done,
ways.
but it takes, we had to grain our horses 4 gallons a day to get that done.
I followed Dale Bliss out from home, from Hinkley one day, out to Middle Pond. And he had a good horse, and he didn't run him or lope him, and it took him 11 hours to get out there. And that's 11 hours was, and that's 38 miles, exactly. So, it could vary a little bit, the conditions and stuff like that, but especially if they're going for 4 or 5 days, they got to give horses time to recover and grain them. And so they had the supplies along the way. Now, I'm going to go clear back to when I came out here first. Up from the trail, and we didn't mention it, along the side of the side hill, there's kind of a little cave just up off the bottom. You remember seeing that? Mm-hmm. Well, we were told when we were scouts that was a place where they actually had somebody with guns to hold off the whole canyon, which is not true because it was just off the wash a little bit. But I can remember going in there that day we came out, and there was cedar posts up across the front, except opening about like that. And there was a lot of dirt that had been blown in through the years, and you could see where sacks, impression of old sacks had been there. You could still see that. And that's always bothered me until about a year or two ago when I found out that they actually had bought some oats from Willow Springs out of Callio, and I think that was one of their graners out here, because it's not that far from the bottom end where the gates are, or the corral is. And so with that in mind, we're going to take you, they head out sometime. Now, I don't know how many days it took them to get to where they were going, but a few. And they got into Montello, Idaho, where their siding was. There wasn't a big town there. There was a little town there now, and there was just pretty much just a water tank and a couple of shacks and stuff like that. At 8:30 in the evening on the 21st of 1883. And they go into the shack where the Chinese section hands are that works on the railroad. They tie them all up and put them back in their shack. And they go over to the section bosses, and there was 4 section bosses there, and they tied them up in their cabin. Their cabin was probably, or shack or whatever it was probably a little bit better than the Chinese. And then they thought, well, the train is not due until about 1 o'clock. And it's, by that time, maybe it's 9 o'clock. So they go in there and fix a good meal. And they're there until it's about time for the train. And in the night, when there's a lot of cold, you can hear a train for a long, long time. Sometimes, the train from where I live is only 3 miles, but sometimes I can't hear it, sometimes it's really loud. And so they were watching for it, and they could see the train coming from the west. It was number 1 Central Pacific coming from the west. In fact, I've got a picture of that train that's been restored in California. And so it's time to go, and they see the train coming, so they got over by the water tank. And one report says they were actually got up on it, they had the red lantern, and started swinging it. Montello was not a stop for the regular train going east. And so the train pulls up and stops, and the engineer climbs down, and there's 2 guys with guns pointed right at his head. And they take him and lock him up. And his name was Casson. And then they go get the brakeman and the fireman and the conductor. And they tie them up and lock them in. Apparently there's a shed under the water tower or near it. Well, pretty soon, the first thing they want to do is go to the Wells Fargo Express wagon. And they go in there and they rap on the door. And the guy kind of slides it open a little bit, and the guns are pointing right at him. He says, "Hop down, or I'm going to shoot you." Guns pointed. Well, what would you do? Ross, that was the guy's name, the last name, he slammed the door shut and dropped the latch down. And so they go back over the other side and pound and try and get it. And they didn't get open. So one part of the story says at that point they go get some picks. But I think they got the picks, but they didn't use them. So they talked to him back and forth and threatened him, and so he even fired a couple of shots, and they fired a couple of shots. They found 40 open shells in in the express car, the Wells Fargo express car, when it was over. And if you read some of the stuff that's going on, it only sounded like that, maybe 4, 5, 6 shots, but they found quite a bunch. So there were some shootings. So the robbers got on all 4 sides of that car, pointed towards the middle, and each one shot towards the middle. It's funny somebody didn't get killed. But it hit him on the finger, it hit him on the hip, and it hit him just below the watch pocket, and I'm not sure which side it was. I've got a picture of him now that I should be able to tell, but I didn't look. And he had pulled some boxes together and covered some things up, and they were pretty assistant still. And they uncoupled, they actually went and got the conductor, uncoupled the car a little bit, and about that time, guess what? Here comes a train from Ogden. What do? Just about 2 hours later, so, they've been working at things pretty good. Until they send somebody down to meet the train, and the train pulls up. By that time, the train that was being robbed got backed off on the siding, or pulled on the siding. This train pulls up alongside, and then the conductor is on the train again. The robbers went and got him. He pulls up, and his name's Clemens, and he says, "What's going on?" He started getting down, and guns again pointed at him. "Get out of here, get that thing down the road." He says he didn't hesitate for a minute. He headed out. So they go, the trains get out of the way, so they go back to work. And they go get the picks, and they start picking it. In the meantime, he can hear somebody climb up the ladder of the car to maybe get on top. And the sounds went pretty good. So when he thought he knew where he was, he pulled the trigger, and he heard it crash. And he didn't know, but at that time he killed a guy named John Bentley. And he fell to the platform. Well, they keep picking away, and it don't work. And so the engineer uncouples the car. I'm not sure how many cars there was. I know there's a tender, and then there's probably the express car, and a mail car, and then a passenger car. The passenger car had 9 people on it, is all it had on it. Well, they uncoupled it so that the mail, I think it was the mail car, was separated from the other couple of cars, and then the express car, the Fargo express car, was back here, and then the engine was up here. And they said, okay. Said they went a couple of lengths above and come back and hit that. Well, guess what? They came back, and bam, both doors flew open. Now, those doors were kind of slide doors, and I think they had kind of a latch that came down, and when it hit, I think it just went like that, and force came open. Somehow, wounded, he was able to get those doors shut. And then they're mad, and they call him some blankety-blank names, and excuse me, but I got to use my handkerchief. And so they say, we're going to burn you out. In fact, they talked about it earlier. And so they go down to the tender car to get some wood. Well, guess what? The tender car is cold, and they had 3 little sticks of wood, so there's no way they could get a fire to burn them out. So they went back and said, they kept telling him, give up, and give up, and he wasn't about to. He was willing to die if he needed to. And so they went back and I think that at that time they had the train come back once more. And guess what? The train didn't have much woof to it, so when it went back, it just the steam was pretty much gone. And so they asked the engineer, the conductor says, well, when's the next train due? About 30 minutes, it should be showing up here. And they halted right there. And they got their horses, and it was reported that there was actually 7 robbers, but apparently there was just 6, and 9 horses. And they get ready and start heading out. Now, I need to tell you about Chinaman. The Chinaman, meanwhile, somehow got loose and went out in the cold bushes. One of them froze to death. The others had severe frostbite. In fact, one story, and I don't think it was true, but this is, I mean, there's so many different versions that newspapers put in. One story says they took them to California, and they were froze so bad, a lot of them, that this shot killed them. But another story said that wasn't true. So the Chinese are out, the robbers are on their way. Guess how much money they got? $10 from the conductor was all they got. Now, one of the stories I heard is they got all kinds of watches from the passengers. There was only 9 passengers. As far as can be determined, the passenger car wasn't touched. Either those people didn't hear, they were dead asleep, or they weren't about to move. It's one of those things. Well, immediately, as soon as they can, they notified authorities, and they immediately gets a posse. There was 2 an excellent tracker from California come, plus another detective and sheriff from Elko, Tabor. He was supposed to be pretty good, and he organized a posse to start after him from that end. And I think there was about 8 in that posse. I've heard more, but I think there was about 8. Meanwhile, the robbers split up. Why? Because they got John Bentley with them over the saddle, and they need to go bury him somewhere. So Nay and Holly has got the body, and they go one way. In fact, to start with, they all went east. Instead of, you'd think you'd go south, but I think they went east to try and throw them off. The next thing we find out is at about noon that day, and I think that was, when the robbers left, I think it was pretty much early morning. And just recently, I come across a thing that Ross, the protector of the car, had sent a telegraph over wire to his bosses saying that they had been robbed and nothing was taken, and he'd been shot, and things would be okay. And lo and behold, on that, it had the date as the 22nd, and I was always told it was the 23rd. And so, unless he made a mistake, and he could have done, and I thought that was kind of interesting to find, but he also had the time of day when he sent and that was at 5:14 in the morning. So they had left, sometime before that. And so about noon, the 3 runs into a sheep camp. There's 2 sheep herders there. Mind you, they say it was between 20 and 30 below zero. I mean, it was cold Jose, any way you want to look at it. They're invited in, as sheep herders would always do, right, Jim? And make them comfortable, and they fixed a nice meal, and after the meal was over, they robbed the sheep camp. They robbed what they had, their watches, and a couple of watches, and some guns, and then they head on their way. The posse gets going about 2 days later, following. Somewhere along the line, they pick up a bunch of horses. And I don't know the whole story there, and I've heard 50 head. I think it was about 29 head. And so they were driving horses ahead of them. And so they're on their way, apparently, to Swayze. And the other 2 haven't met up with them. There's a sheriff from Twila named Gilleps. I can't remember how to say it. I don't know. Anyway, he was I want to say Gillespie, but it's not that, from Twilla had got word that the robbers were heading to Swayze. So he telephones or wires down to Deseret. He wires to a Sheriff Turner in Utah County. It might have been before Deseret. They get organized and send a special car down. And apparently a couple of them went the day before, but now we're about the 27th of January. And I found where at least 6 authorities went down. They even got a cannon, a small cannon, out of Nevada or somewhere they brought in. John Devine, whose store was robbed, was going to be ended up being the posse from Deseret. They got down to Deseret, and so it would have been on the 27th. The next day was Sunday, the 28th. Joseph Black, who's probably your relative, you tie him in, don't you? Mm-hmm. Was contacted, can you help put a posse together? And so they got a posse of approximately 10 men, I'm not sure exactly. One place I heard the total amount was 17. I'm wondering if it was more than that, and maybe some of the sheriffs didn't get counted, but I think the sheriffs wanted to get the money on the reward. And so they said, we gotta wait. I'll just tell you just a few people I know was there. Ed Crafts, Joe Ray. Now, Ed Crafts and Joe Ray were noted to be people like Porter Rockwell. There was seriously, they were something else to deal with. But there's Bishop Black, and there was a Hale, and there was Weiss Cropper, and there was a Meekum, and I've got a list of them, the ones that I've been able to find and document. I've got a list of one that somebody told me, but I can't document it. It probably is there. So Sunday night at 12:30 a.m., or excuse me, 12 o'clock a.m., 30 below zero or close to it, with a baggage wagon, and I think they also had some type of buggy or something, and their horses, they headed to Swayze. And as near as I can tell, they headed over to probably Swayze Springs, where most people would come out to Swayze to be water and camp. And so if they left there, I'm assuming they got there probably in the afternoon sometime, because they just had to stop and have a nice breakfast, rest the horses, feed them and stuff like that. So anyway, so they're around camp and they're setting up, deciding what to do, and they decide, okay, we got to go and find that canyon where the robbers are. So they head out, and they leave the wagon and stuff there. And they get over, and I pointed this out to Kevin and you guys. Down here a little ways, I think is where they were at, over a little hill about 300 feet high or so, a ridge. And they looked down the valley coming, and there was 2 horsemen. The day before, the other 3 came into camp with those horses, okay? And so when they got fairly close to them, the posse kind of got in position, and they hollered at them to stop. And as soon as they realized what was going on, the robbers got off and started shooting. Bam, bam, bam. And Joseph Ray, after the shooting was going on, and some of them, after the shooting was going on, all of a sudden he told Cropper, he says, man, they're not messing around. The bullet hit right between the guy's leg. I think they were just kind of scaring him, as the posse was trying to scare him. Well, so they got a little more serious on both sides, and Nay was shot. He was shot, I'm not sure which shoulder it was. He was shot in the shoulder and went up through the back, and he was hurting for certain, big time. And they shot their horses first. And he finally throws up his hands and quits. And Holly, he's crawling out through the brush a little bit. And they start hollering at him. And he's shooting, and he's shot in the leg. And so pretty soon he has surrendered. And Nay is bad shape. Well, where's the wagon or the buggy or whatever they had? They definitely had a wagon. They sent, there's two stories. One is they sent a Western back, and if it had been a Westerner, it was probably Sam. And another story said that Joseph Smith Black went, but I don't know about that.
Oh,
And,
they're
another one.
They're relatives.
Yeah. But they made it down, but he was I think he kind of was the shepherd, I guess what I'm saying. And so,
Joseph Smith Black Jr. married Sam's daughter.
okay, that could have been then. So anyway, can you imagine a guy, and one report said it was a guy named Hale, and we don't know his first name, but we think maybe it was in Grantfields. Might have been Natalie's relative, but we don't know for sure. And so they send the guy over to bring the wagon or the buggy or whatever they want. Can you imagine going over in the dark of the night by that time? I mean, it's dark to get that buggy. And it'd been probably, well, how far is it from here back over the Springs? How would they gone?
This way.
Long way.
Yeah, how would they gone? Would they went down the valley and follow, or do you think there was road away? Coming across.
Coming across those
I'll tell you,
foothills.
coming across is not an easy thing. We've tried it in Jeep once, and it isn't easy. So anyway, they got it and got it back. And about that time, here comes another guy coming up the canyon. In fact, I think there was two, because they said a boy coming up the canyon. How old's a boy?
19.
Yeah, at least.
Maybe.
Yeah,
Maybe
you know,
12.
maybe older. I
15,
don't know.
I don't know.
And he comes over because he sees all the action. He thinks it's his group of robber friends. We think that he was one. We think they were. I think there was two. Some says one. Were the Smith brothers from Fish Springs. Almost positive on that. And they may have been into it roundabout. Because why would all of a sudden the Smith brothers show up on scene? They weren't at the robbery site, but I think they might have had something to do with something. I'm not sure exactly what. And so one story says they asked the boy to do an errand for him, and they had the robbers sign a note saying, "Give up. It's not worth it. And we're wounded bad. Give up." And so they send Nay and Holly on the wagon towards Deseret, hoping it'll get there in time the next morning. They can get them on a train and get them up to Salt Lake, which does happen. Okay, so now the posse's all around, and it's later in the evening. In fact, it's early morning, and it's about 2 o'clock. It's dark, and all of a sudden, here comes a group of people, and it's that posse that was coming from the north. They show up, and so they talk around and mill around, and I think that's when they says, "Well, okay, how are we going to divvy up the rewards?" And by the way, eventually they get $350 a piece, and that's a lot of money back in those days. And so, next thing to do is they're going to send the boy up and follow him, or the boys, if there's two, to take this note up to the cabin right down here, just a little ways, that Jim talked about. And the cabin, well, I'll describe the cabin later. If I forget to, let me know. And so if they say, "Okay, who wants to follow the boy, stay out of sight, and go up and see if we can get him?" See all the volunteers raise their hand and look around? all the sheriffs and everything, yeah, they weren't about to volunteer. Guess who volunteered? William Ray and Weiss Cropper. He says, nobody else is going, let's go. And I think it was one of them, it might have been Ray, says, how could I live, have my kids know that I didn't stand up for right and go do something? So they take off and they follow, stay out of the way. Now you can see coming up there, you could stay out of the way. And got to remind you, it's still evening, it's still dark, it's early morning. The moon's probably out, I'm not sure. I did not check. I could probably have found out if the moon was out, but let's assume it was out, so there was some daylight. And so they followed him up to the cabin. And Cropper and Ray, according to Ray's writing, on the opposite the cabin, across the wash, looking almost straight west. Might have been a little on an angle. You get up here, your direction's a little bit different. They set up to see what they can do, like getting these kids. They take their coats off, puts them on trees to make them look like there's four. And one of them makes the comment, man, this is the skinniest tree I've ever been behind in my life, and they was trying to shade yourself. And then the cabin is sitting down here, like I tell you, and it's made out of rock, as near as we can tell. Race Bar thought it was wood, but it isn't. And it was rocked up, and then it had a shed roof on. In fact, it's dug out, so it's kind of like a dugout with rock, and then it has a kind of a shed roof, and you got some portholes in the front, probably in the side. And there's a gray blanket in front for a door. Well, the kid goes in the cabin and gives a note, and nothing happens. And so they're hollering and says, give up, we got you surrounded, you need to come out. And so one of them comes out, and one story says he heads up the hill. Another story just says he comes out with his hands up, and pretty soon the other two's out. Now that would be Francis at 40, and a lot of people think he was the main leader, but I don't know, and he very well could have been. And then we've been Raz Anderson and Sylvester Earle, the two 19-year-old boys. And they came out and surrendered. Another story says that they said, we got a cannon pouring you, there's somebody in every hole in this canyon. And I still to this day don't know whether the rest of the posse worked all their way up here or not. I don't know that. Now, remember me talking about Ed Crafts and Red Charles Webb? Charles Webb is Ron Peterson's great-grandfather, and he didn't even know this story. And he didn't know why some of his kids got red hair. Well, we found out since Red Charles Red was called Red because he had red hair. Ron didn't know that. So they were going to meet the posse, but they got here early, and they was waiting down the bottom of the canyon. This is the night before now, so I'm backing up just a little bit. And they finally decided, well, let's just go see what we can do. Remember, they're like Puerto Rockwells. So they said, let's go up and wander up in there and just say that, it's getting dark on us, and could we stay with you? We're out looking for some horses or cattle or something. That's an excuse. I've heard both of them. And so that's what they did. And so they got in the cabin and had dinner and eventually goes to sleep. Red Charles Craft, he can't even hardly close his eyes, and he's just shaking because they're nervous. And Ed Crafts is just sawing the logs like you can't believe. Like nothing in the world bothers him. Now, Kevin, you know that Ralph Crafts had a problem. That family has a problem. they'll just drop off and go to sleep, just like that. Just, and I'll tell you a story, and then we get back. If I get, you might have sidetracked me back. One day, my wife and I was taking Ralph Crafts over to Manti Temple one evening. It was in my old blue truck. And we were talking, and we just pulled out of Delta, past Maverick, which wasn't there then. And we just barely passed there, and he was telling us a story, and all of a sudden it just shut off. My wife, and I thought, well, you know, Ralph's that way a little bit. Going along a little bit further, and I was getting worried. Did he die on us right there? Because I had another guy just about do the same thing, exactly. Partner Dale. We got up about where the cheese plant is, and all of a sudden he lifts his head up and he starts talking. He didn't miss a word. And so that's kind of what I think Ed Crafts was like, you know. And so he was sawing the logs. Well, they got through the night, and guess what happens? You know, we got the robbers out of the house, and we got them, out of the little cabin or house, whatever you want to call it, gets them tied up, and guess who walks out of the cabin? Joseph Ray and Ed Crafts. Did I say Wisecropper before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, some people think he was there, and that's, so I got that story mixed
You
up.
said Wise was the one that was,
Following him.
followed him up there.
Yeah,
and told him
okay,
to
well,
come
he
out.
wasn't in the cabin. It was, and some people thinks he was. But it, so Ed Crafts and Joseph Ray walks out of the cabin. And they get down to him, and they're talking, and the one that was probably Francis says, you know, I woke up 3 times during the night, and I was going to shoot you guys both right in the head. He says, I don't know why I didn't. I don't know why I didn't, but he didn't. And so they get the robbers down and takes them to Deseret. They take them up to Salt Lake. In fact, they might be in Deseret for a few days. I don't know why. And they stayed in the house of Josie Moody, that one on Main Street. I got a picture of it. It's Janelle Young's relatives through her mother, through the Cahoons. I got a picture of the house, and he said it was the east room that they jailed him in. They got him up to Salt Lake. Nay's up there in recovery. They're indicted and taken to Elko, and it was a little rigmarole. And they finally have court on them. Nay is not there, but they went ahead and had a court on them. They were sentenced, Nye and Holly and Francis was sentenced to 14 years in penitentiary. Rastus Anderson, Raz they call him, and Sylvester Earl was sentenced to 12. And so they go to prison. Nay's family lived in Deseret, was living in Deseret. In fact, they were living with Bishop Black for a while. And she followed them out to Elko and stayed out there for, I guess, till he got released. And I'm not sure how long that he served. It may have been 10 years. But Ras Anderson and Sylvester Earl served 4 years, 4 months, and 11 days, and then they got out. Now, you think that's almost the story. But the most important all is coming ahead, and until probably 6 months ago or so, or a year ago, nobody else knew this part. There's a guy, when I first started researching this, in 2003, I got pretty serious on this. And I was reading about a little bit about the train robbery, and there was a guy named Philip Earl, and he lived in Reno. And I got a hold of him. I says, I see you have made a little spill about the train robbery out in Montana. He says, yeah, I did. I said, would you share it? I says, I know the story on the other end. He says, yeah, I'll share what I've got. And I says, I've been thinking about writing it up. And he says, you know, I wrote a little bit up years ago, but I didn't know anything about this end. But he says, I want to rewrite that, so I decided not to do anything, and I haven't done anything, but he's died since. But he said his first job for the state historical society was to look at criminals in Nevada and see what their ancestry was from. Were they Italian, English, Dutch, or whatever? Just that, all they were doing is see if maybe some different people were more prone to be criminals than others. And he's reading along, and all of a sudden he sees the name Sylvester Earle. You look down at that, and he says, Sylvester Earle, that's my grandfather. And he had never, ever heard anything about this robbery. Nor, I don't think, there's probably one or two might have in the family. He didn't have an idea. So he checked it out, and that's where I got a lot of my initial source material from Philip. And he was going to come and go out with me. And his sister lived in I just went blank, by the canal, by the church, Robinson's place. Maybe you guys know who she is. And she came over and talked to me one day, and he wanted to come out, but he never did. And he's died since. Now for the good part. This is the good part, as far as I'm concerned. Sylvester Earle goes on the right side of the law. We find him later down in Virgin, Utah, down by Zion's. And he's serving as a bishop, and he served for 12 years as a bishop. So does the atonement and forgiveness happen? And I just think that ends up just a really good story that could have been real bad. So that's my story from what I've learned, and there's many stories that could be told. One story that I've been trying to track down that Shanna told me, he says that they were hid over in Ely one day. Maybe you've heard this story. In a casino or something, there was a little kid in there. I don't know how the kid was, and that they robbed it, and actually had killed somebody, and so they took the kid with him. And that he was out here, and he was the kid that, came out, went over the hill, and Ed Crass followed him for 33 days. And I don't know about that story. There might be some to it, might be something different, but I can't find anything solid on that. And then what about the trails? Going down to Death Canyon, there's a trail that comes up Death Canyon, up through the two flat spots or meadows on top by Sinbad. Before that, there wasn't. There was a lot of stuff. It was thick timber. I remember when they dozed that off and cut it, and went through and dropped over into this area. So the robbers they could come up the bottom, they could come up the ridge part way, they could come over this ridge part way or go down it. They could go up over the top and go back over the top and drop in by Sawmill and go over to Sinbad and down that trail and out. They had lots of ways they could go out. We don't know how long they were here, and we don't know how many robberies were done by those or others. I told you that Ben Tasker was out here for years, so somewhere along the line there were some things going on, because just the type of person that Ben Tasker was. On the side note, some of these guys were working for Ben Tasker out in Nevada building fence the year before. And so, it all ties. And Earl and Nay ties into relative. I was told that they were several of them from Fillmore, and even given the names. And nothing I found is showing that. Probably Nay's the closest one, and because they were living in Deseret. Now, Jim, you brought up that they were some sharp shooters. I was always bothered by that. That story, I just didn't, how could that happen, when they got. But I think after they robbed the Divine Store about the 25th of December, before they did the train robbery. They went in there and they was flashing watches around and a few other things they might have got from other places, and that's when they were down on the slough. I can't even remember what slough was, but there's a name of it, down, basically shooting contest, and they said that those robbers are pretty good shooters, and so there's lots of side things. There's probably more story to develop, but I think the story about the train in Wendover was actually up a little bit further, just because, you know,
Oh,
Wendover's
I just
probably
know by
closest one.
Wendover. I didn't-
Yeah, by Wendover, but you're right, yeah, if it said by Wendover. So I probably missed something, but is there any questions or?
Well, they did all that for